Hello everyone, my name's Aaron, and let me tell you, my life has taken a wild turn lately. I'm 34 years old, just your run-of-the-mill warehouse manager living in Columbus. Nothing about my life was flashy or extraordinary, but it was solid. I had a good job, a cozy house, and a wife, Helen. We'd been together for 5 years and married for 3. I thought things were steady. Sure, we weren't the over-the-top romantic couple you see in movies, but we made it work. Bills got paid, we had our date nights, and the occasional argument felt like part of the usual marriage routine. At least, that's how I saw it. About 6 months ago, though, Helen decided to start this intense fitness journey. It came out of nowhere, but I was supportive. She joined some fancy gym downtown that looked more like a luxury spa, hired a personal trainer named Chris, and got deep into meal prepping, counting macros, and detox plans. At first, I thought it was great. I even encouraged her. After all, everyone deserves to feel good about themselves, right? I figured it was just a phase, like the time she got into knitting or her brief obsession with tarot cards. In the beginning, I even pitched in more at home, handling the dishes, laundry, and errands so she'd have time for her workouts. I thought it was a thoughtful way to show I cared. But as time passed, things started shifting, and not in a good way. The more weight Helen lost, the more her ego seemed to grow. She became fixated on her reflection, spending hours tweaking her gym outfits and snapping progress photos for Instagram. It stopped being about her personal goals and turned into a performance for an audience. One Friday night, I suggested we watch a movie together, like we used to. I thought it'd be a nice way to unwind. But she just scoffed and said, "Aaron, I don't have time to sit around. I have goals to crush." Goals? What goals? It wasn't like she was training for a marathon or climbing Mount Everest. She was lifting weights and drinking green smoothies. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was the one being unreasonable. Then came the morning that changed everything. It started like any other, me half asleep, sipping my coffee, and Helen drinking her kale and spinach smoothie in her workout gear, glued to her phone. Out of the blue, she said, "I deserve more in life." Still groggy, I mumbled, "More of what?" She set her smoothie down and looked at me dead serious. "This marriage is holding me back, Aaron. I'm filing for divorce." I laughed, thinking she was joking. But when I saw her expression, stone cold, no trace of humor, I realized she wasn't. "I've outgrown this," she said, like I was an old piece of furniture she was ready to toss. "You wouldn't understand." I sat there, stunned, trying to wrap my head around her words. Anger and disbelief started bubbling up. "What do you mean, outgrown this?" "Outgrown what?" I asked. She sighed, like I was too dense to get it. "Aaron, I've been working on myself, trying to be the best version of me. And frankly, this life doesn't match my potential anymore. I want more than this house, this routine, more than you." Her words hit me like a freight train. She didn't sugarcoat a thing. To her, I was just another part of the life she wanted to leave behind. Without saying another word, she grabbed her gym bag and walked out, leaving me sitting there, staring at the half-empty glass of green sludge she'd left behind. That day at work was a complete blur. I went through the motions, but my head was spinning. Was this real? Was she seriously leaving me? Sure, we'd had our ups and downs, but divorce? It felt so abrupt, like she'd been planning this for weeks. The rehearsed tone of her words made it clear she'd already made up her mind. In the days that followed, the cracks in our marriage became impossible to ignore. Helen barely spoke to me unless it was about splitting the house or arranging mediation. She started staying out late, claiming she was at the gym or with friends. Her phone was glued to her hand, and her Instagram was flooded with selfies and captions like, "New chapter, who dis?" and "Living my best life." Each post felt like a slap in the face, a constant reminder that she'd mentally moved on long before the paperwork was finalized. One night, scrolling through social media, I noticed she'd erased every trace of me. Our wedding photos, anniversary posts, all of it gone. Meanwhile, her new posts were racking up likes and comments. "You're glowing. Such an inspiration." Every compliment made me feel sick to my stomach. None of these people had a clue about the real Helen, or the hell she was putting me through. One night, as I was getting ready for work, I overheard her in the kitchen on the phone. She was using that fake sweet voice she always pulled out when she wanted to butter someone up. "Yeah, I just feel so free now," she said, followed by a little giggle. "I'm finally doing what makes me happy." Then came the kicker. He doesn't even get it. He's stuck in the past. That hit me like a brick. Helen wasn't just leaving me. She was remaking herself entirely. And in her eyes, I was just dead weight. The anchor she had to cut loose to sail off into her shiny new life. But here's the thing. I'm not the kind of guy who lets someone walk all over him without a fight. She thought she could steamroll me and leave me with nothing, but she was in for a rude awakening. This was far from over. Then things took an even uglier turn. One afternoon, I was grabbing lunch at a cafe near work, scrolling through my phone, when I overheard a couple of guys at the next table chatting. They were laughing about some fitness influencer they'd found online. I didn't think much of it until one of them mentioned her name, Helen. My stomach dropped. They kept talking, joking about how she was teasing some premium content for her followers. I tried to tell myself it couldn't be her, not my Helen. But then one of them pulled up her Instagram, and there she was, clear as day. My wife. They were going on about her links to an OnlyFans account, how she'd been posting captions like, "For the real workouts." My blood boiled. This wasn't just about fitness anymore. Helen had turned herself into some online thirst trap to make money. When I got home, I couldn't hold back. She was lounging on the couch, glued to her phone as usual. "Helen," I said, trying to keep my temper in check. "What the hell is this OnlyFans thing I'm hearing about?" She looked up, completely unfazed. "It's my body, Aaron. My choice. And it's none of your business anymore." I couldn't believe her nerve. None of my business? We're still married, and you're out here selling yourself online while I'm trying to keep our lives together. She rolled her eyes like I was some clueless dinosaur. "It's not selling myself. It's content creation. Everyone does it. And besides, it's not like you're paying my bills anymore." That was the moment it hit me. Helen didn't just want out of our marriage. She wanted to rewrite her whole story, cast herself as the star, and leave me as nothing more than a forgotten footnote. She wasn't even embarrassed about it. If anything, she was proud, like she'd finally found her true calling as some kind of online spectacle. In the weeks that followed, things escalated. Helen started dressing like she was auditioning for a reality show. Tight dresses, sky-high heels, and makeup so thick it looked like she'd applied it with a trowel. Every time she left the house, she looked like she was heading to a red carpet event instead of the grocery store. And her social media posts? They were unbearable. Living my truth. No more holding back. And the one that made me want to smash my phone, she's not a wife anymore. She's a force of nature. While Helen was out playing Instagram celebrity, I was left cleaning up her mess. Lawyers, paperwork, the whole 9 yards. But Helen wasn't as untouchable as she thought. My lawyer, Alan, who deserves a medal for his work, started digging into her life. And what he found? Oh, it was gold. Turns out, Helen had been cozying up to someone new. A gold digger, to be exact. And wouldn't you know it? It was Chris, her personal trainer. Real original. Huh? The second I heard his name, I knew this wasn't just a professional relationship. Chris was exactly the kind of guy you'd expect to see on a cheesy reality dating show. Ripped, spray-tanned, and as deep as a puddle. He had the whole package. Smarmy charm, bulging muscles, and that cocky smirk that made you want to punch him. Helen wasn't subtle about it either. One day, she came home glowing. "Chris says I'm the strongest I've ever been," she bragged, not even looking at me. "Yeah, Helen, I'm sure Chris also told you you're his most amazing client ever," I muttered to myself. Before long, she wasn't even pretending it was about workouts anymore. She'd casually drop his name into conversations. "Chris is taking me to this new vegan restaurant," or "Chris said this protein powder is life-changing." It didn't stop there. Word got around quickly. Friends started texting me with reports of Helen and Chris spotted all over town, holding hands, laughing, acting like the poster couple for Instagram. One night, Helen came home and flat out said it. "Just so you know, Chris and I are dating now. I think it's time you accept that." Accept it? Sure, I accepted it. I accepted that my wife had turned into a walking, talking cliché of entitlement. She'd mentally checked out of our marriage long before. So what was one more betrayal to add to the pile? But here's where it gets interesting. Alan, my lawyer, dug deeper into Chris's past. Turns out, this wasn't his first rodeo. He had a pattern, a real playbook. Find a married woman, shower her with compliments, pump up her ego, convince her to leave her husband, and then, once the dust settled and the money dried up, he'd vanish. Chris wasn't chasing love. He was running a hustle. And Helen? She was his perfect target, eating up his validation like candy. The worst part? How smug he was about it. I started hearing from mutual acquaintances that Chris was already making big plans for the future. Apparently, Chris had the nerve to tell someone, once the divorce is finalized, Helen and I are going to build an empire. An empire? Really? You're a personal trainer, not a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. But hey, dream big, right? The kicker was, Chris wasn't just eyeing Helen's money. He had his sights on mine, too. Helen was demanding half my savings, spousal support, and even trying to take the house. She thought she could waltz into court, play the victim, and walk out with enough cash to fund their little fantasy life. What she didn't know was that my lawyer, Alan, was 2 steps ahead of her. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. Let me paint you a picture of Helen and Chris as a couple. Imagine a guy who owns nothing but tank tops standing next to a woman who suddenly thinks she's a Kardashian. Their social media accounts were overflowing with photos of them posing in front of luxury cars they didn't own and tagging themselves at expensive restaurants that were probably funded by Helen's splurging. They were trying so hard to shout, "Look at us, we're winning." But to anyone paying attention, it was obvious they were overcompensating. Their relationship wasn't without its cracks, though. Chris's over-the-top ego started clashing with Helen's growing diva complex. One night, I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen, arguing. "I don't care what your exes said about you, Chris. You're with me now, and I deserve better than your baggage." I didn't catch the rest, but it was enough to tell me their fairy tale was already unraveling. As infuriating as it was, there was a strange satisfaction in watching Helen pour everything into Chris. She was convinced he was her ticket to a better life. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the whole thing fell apart, and I was making sure of it. After mediation, Helen's confidence took a nosedive. She walked in acting like Beyoncé and walked out looking like a deer caught in headlights. It was a sight to behold. Chris, her so-called cheerleader, didn't even bother to console her. He sulked behind her, glued to his phone. That was my first clue that their empire wasn't as unshakable as Helen wanted people to believe. Let's rewind to mediation for a second. It wasn't just a minor setback for Helen. It was a complete disaster. She strutted in, probably thinking a few tears would guarantee her the house, half my savings, and spousal support. Her lawyer painted her as some martyr who had sacrificed everything for my so-called mediocre dreams. Mediocre dreams? Excuse me? Those were the same dreams I worked my ass off to build, taking on a demanding warehouse job for years to keep us afloat. Thankfully, Alan wasn't about to let their sob story slide. He came armed with spreadsheets, credit card statements, and screenshots that painted a very different picture. Turns out, Helen had been draining our joint account for months before filing for divorce. Spa days, designer clothes, $200 dinners, all while I was at home eating leftovers and wondering where our money was going. Then Alan dropped the real bombshell, Chris's skeletons. His history of seducing married women, convincing them to leave their husbands, and then ghosting them once the money dried up. Alan even had messages from one of Chris's exes warning Helen about his pattern. Of course, Helen didn't listen. She thought she was different. Chris's smug face was priceless as Alan laid everything out. That cocky grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure discomfort. Helen, in a desperate attempt to save face, defended him. "Chris isn't like that anymore," she insisted. But the evidence said otherwise. By the end of the session, it was clear Helen wasn't going to walk away with the golden ticket she'd hoped for. And Chris? He looked like he was already plotting his next move. After that, Helen's attitude shifted. She wasn't strutting around like she owned the world anymore. Her Instagram posts went from "living my best life" to vague, desperate captions like, "Growth isn't always easy, but it's worth it." Sure, Helen, keep telling yourself that. As for Chris, his role in her life started fading fast. No more public appearances. No more couple goals gym photos. Word on the street was he'd already moved on to another client, a younger woman without Helen's baggage. Classic Chris. One night, Helen came home late. I was still living in the house with her at the time because, legally, I couldn't kick her out yet. She stumbled in, looking completely drained, dropped her designer bag on the counter, and sighed like she wanted me to ask what was wrong. I wasn't about to play into her drama. I just stayed on the couch and let her sulk. The next morning, she was in the kitchen making one of her infamous kale smoothies, but the usual smugness wasn't there. Out of nowhere, she muttered, Chris has been busy with his clients. I knew she was fishing for a reaction, but I wasn't biting. Then, a week later, the real fireworks started. Alan called to let me know Helen had filed some last-minute paperwork, claiming she deserved emotional compensation for the stress I'd caused her during the marriage. Emotional compensation. Can you believe that? Helen was trying to cash in on her midlife crisis and pin the blame on me. But Alan, being the legend he is, was ready. He countersued, highlighting how Helen had drained our finances and twisted the situation for her benefit. He even included screenshots of her Instagram posts as evidence. Those captions were solid gold, proof that she wasn't a victim but a self-absorbed diva living it up at my expense. And then, just like that, Chris disappeared. He stopped showing up to their gym sessions, stopped answering her calls, and even blocked her on Instagram. That's right, he blocked Helen. She lost it, pacing around the house, calling him over and over. Chris, call me back. We need to talk. It was almost sad to watch. Almost. She sounded desperate, and honestly, I won't lie, it was satisfying to see. Eventually, one of her friends let the truth slip. Chris had moved on to a newer client, someone younger, flashier, and most importantly, not tangled up in a messy divorce. Helen was crushed. She tried to keep up appearances with cryptic posts like, "Sometimes people aren't who they seem, and you can't build an empire with someone who's playing games." But it was obvious to everyone what had happened. Her perfect man had bolted the moment things got tough. That's when Helen's carefully crafted image really began to crumble. She stopped going to the gym, traded her glamorous outfits for sweatpants and messy buns, and even took a break from Instagram. It was as if her entire identity had been tied to Chris and the fantasy life they were supposed to have. Without him, she seemed completely lost. One evening, she tried to talk to me. "Aaron," she said, standing in the doorway of the living room, "I think we need to reevaluate everything. This divorce, it's been hard on both of us." I just stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "What are you getting at, Helen?" I asked. She let out a dramatic sigh, trying to sound vulnerable. "I just think maybe we rushed into all of this. I mean, we had good times, didn't we?" I almost laughed in her face. "Helen, you filed for divorce. You told me I was holding you back, remember? Now that Chris is gone, you're having second thoughts? Unbelievable." She tried to play the sympathy card, going on about how lonely she was and how much she'd sacrificed for our marriage. I wasn't having it. "Helen," I said, cutting her off, "you made your bed. Now lie in it." At that point, her little fantasy world was collapsing, and I didn't even have to lift a finger. Karma was doing all the heavy lifting. Let me walk you through how the courtroom drama unfolded, because it was a sight to behold. By the time the court date rolled around, Helen's usual bravado had vanished. No designer blazer, no smug grin. Just her and her lawyer looking like two kids walking into detention. She must have known it wasn't going to go her way. The whole vibe was off, and I was savoring every second of it. On my side, there was Alan, my lawyer, armed with a binder so thick it could have been used as a weapon. At that point, I wasn't nervous. Helen had thrown every punch she could, and I was still standing. Today wasn't just about surviving, it was about winning. Helen's lawyer kicked things off with her claim for emotional compensation. He painted her as a long-suffering wife emotionally drained by my supposed lack of support for her personal growth. Apparently, my unwillingness to cheer on her fitness journey, which we all knew was code for her affair with Chris, was now considered neglect. Alan let him talk, letting him dig his own hole. And then it was our turn. Alan methodically dismantled their case. First, he presented evidence showing that not only had I supported Helen, but I'd gone above and beyond during her so-called fitness journey. He pulled out proof that I'd taken on extra chores, adjusted my work schedule, and even encouraged her to pursue her goals. He read out text messages where I'd offered to make her healthy meals, suggested we attend couples fitness classes, and cheered on her gym progress. Then Alan dropped the real bombshell. He pointed out that Helen's claim for emotional compensation wasn't just baseless. It was a cover for her own emotional neglect. He presented emails and texts where Helen had mocked me to her friends, calling me boring and dead weight. He even had screenshots of her bragging about Chris, referring to me as her backup plan. But the knockout punch came when Alan tackled the financial side. He presented bank statements showing how Helen had drained thousands of dollars from our joint account to fund her luxury lifestyle. Spa days, designer clothes, and $200 dinners. All while I was eating leftovers and trying to figure out where all the money had gone. Helen's lawyer tried to counter, but Alan wasn't done. He unveiled the ultimate piece of evidence, a journal entry that Alan had subpoenaed. In it, Helen had outlined her entire plan. To leave me, drain as much as she could from the marriage, and use the settlement money to start fresh with Chris. The judge's face as he read that entry was priceless, pure disbelief. The courtroom was dead silent as the judge flipped through the paperwork, his expression growing darker with each page. Helen sat next to her lawyer, visibly shaken, her perfectly manicured nails tapping nervously on the table. Her confidence, which she'd flaunted so boldly during mediation, had completely vanished. On the other side of the room, I sat with Alan, feeling a mix of anticipation and satisfaction. This was it, the moment where Helen's carefully spun narrative would finally unravel. The judge addressed her emotional compensation claim first. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice calm but firm, "your request for emotional compensation lacks substantive evidence." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "While emotional distress can be a valid consideration in some cases, this court requires clear, demonstrable proof. Your claims are based on subjective feelings, not facts." Then he turned to Alan's counterarguments. He recounted the text messages, bank statements, and Instagram posts that painted a far different picture than the one Helen and her lawyer had tried to sell. "Mr. Patterson," the judge said, finally addressing me, "you have demonstrated a clear and consistent pattern of support for your wife throughout this marriage. The evidence shows no indication of emotional neglect," the judge said, his tone deliberate and firm. "In fact, it suggests quite the opposite. Mr. Patterson went above and beyond to support your needs and aspirations." Helen's lawyer tried to object, stammering something about the evidence being taken out of context, but the judge shut him down with a raised hand. "The context is clear, counselor. Let's move on." The judge then turned to the financial aspect of the case, carefully reviewing the documents Alan had prepared. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice now colder, "you withdrew over $223,000 from your joint accounts leading up to this divorce filing. These funds were not allocated for household expenses or shared needs, but were instead used for luxury items, fine dining, and personal indulgences." Helen squirmed in her seat, her face flushing red. Her lawyer attempted to excuse the spending as a coping mechanism for a difficult time, but the judge wasn't buying it. "Coping mechanisms do not justify financial recklessness," he snapped. Then the discussion moved to the house. Helen had insisted she was entitled to half, arguing that she had contributed emotionally, if not financially, to its upkeep. Alan was ready for this. He presented records proving that I had paid the mortgage in full, handled all the renovations, and maintained the property without any help from Helen. "The house will remain the property of Mr. Patterson," the judge declared without hesitation. "Mrs. Patterson, you have no financial claim to it based on the evidence presented." Helen's jaw dropped. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her, but she waved him off, too stunned to respond. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "due to the unauthorized use of marital funds, Mrs. Patterson is ordered to reimburse Mr. Patterson in the amount of $23,750. The courtroom went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Helen's lawyer slumped in his chair, visibly defeated, while Helen sat motionless, looking like the wind had been knocked out of her. Her carefully crafted narrative had unraveled completely, leaving her with nothing but the fallout of her own actions. The ruling was final. No appeals, no loopholes. The judge closed his folder and said, "This court is adjourned." I leaned back in my chair, a wave of relief washing over me. Justice had been served, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. As I left the courtroom, the tension in the air was palpable. Helen's lawyer was already packing up, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Helen trailed behind him, her head hung low. For someone who had started this process with all the swagger of a reality TV star, she now looked utterly defeated. Alan gave me a pat on the back as we walked out. "We did it," he said with a small smile. I nodded, grateful for his relentless work. Not only had he defended me, but he had exposed Helen's manipulative tactics for what they were. As I stepped out of the courthouse, I glanced back at Helen. She was standing there, staring blankly at the floor. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for her, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She had orchestrated this chaos and was now facing the consequences. In the days that followed, the fallout from the ruling became impossible for Helen to avoid. She was ordered to vacate the house within 30 days, and I made sure she stuck to it. She tried to stall, claiming she needed more time to sort things out, but I wasn't having it. "You had plenty of time to prepare while you were busy flaunting your affair with Chris," I reminded her. Begrudgingly, she packed her things and moved out. Watching her leave that final day was oddly satisfying. She loaded her designer luggage into an old, borrowed car and drove off without so much as a goodbye. The house, once a battleground of tension and resentment, finally felt peaceful. Helen's financial situation took a nosedive. Without access to my income or the marital funds she'd been draining, she was forced to fend for herself. She tried selling off some of her designer clothes and handbags, but it barely made a dent in the debt she owed me. Word spread quickly that she was borrowing money from friends, but even they grew tired of her sob stories. As for Chris, he vanished completely. He ignored her calls and messages, and eventually, he blocked her on Instagram. About 2 weeks after the ruling, Helen showed up at the house unannounced. When I opened the door, she stood there, her once flawless appearance replaced by messy hair and tired eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Aaron," she said softly, her voice cracking, "can we talk?" I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "What do you want, Helen?" She hesitated, wringing her hands. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I made mistakes, big ones. I let Chris manipulate me. I got caught up in this fantasy and I ruined everything." Her words felt rehearsed, but the desperation in her eyes seemed genuine. Still, I wasn't moved. She wasn't here out of remorse. She was here because she had nowhere else to turn. "I don't know what you expect me to say," I replied, my tone steady but firm. "You made your choices, Helen. You chose Chris. You chose to try and take everything from me," I said, my voice steady. "And now you're dealing with the fallout." Tears welled up in her eyes as she choked out, "I just can't. Can we at least be civil? Maybe start over? I have nothing, Aaron. I'm lost." I stared at her for a long moment, feeling nothing but a sense of resolve. "Helen," I said, "I gave you everything. My support, my trust, my love. And you threw it all away. You don't get to come back now and ask for a second chance. That's not how this works." She broke down, sobbing on my porch, but I didn't flinch. After a moment, I stepped back inside and shut the door, leaving her outside with her regrets. Since that day, I've moved on. Life has a strange way of twisting in directions you'd never expect. After everything with Helen, I figured she'd fade into obscurity, just another casualty of her own bad decisions. But one evening, as I scrolled through social media, something caught my eye that stopped me cold. A headline, "Helen Patterson, from heartbreak to internet sensation." At first, I dismissed it as clickbait, maybe just a coincidence, but curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the link. What I saw left me stunned. Helen had reinvented herself completely. She was now a major name in the adult film industry, her face plastered across websites and magazine covers. I could hardly believe it. The woman I once knew, who had been so obsessed with appearances and status, was now flaunting everything in the most public way imaginable. Sure, Helen had always been beautiful, but this was a far cry from the person I'd married. The confidence and unapologetic persona she projected now were unrecognizable. She wasn't just embracing the attention, she was thriving in it. But the real kicker wasn't her new career. No, the shocker was that Chris was back in her life. Not as a lover this time, but as her manager. He wasn't lurking in the background either. He was front and center, handling her contracts, making her the face of their so-called empire. The man who had blown up my life and stolen Helen from me was now cashing in on her success. It felt like a bad joke, but there was no punchline. Helen had found fame, wealth, and, from the looks of it, a twisted sense of fulfillment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Chris had always wanted Helen, and now he had her. In a way neither of them could have predicted. He had manipulated her into betraying me, and now he was parading her as the centerpiece of their empire. I won't lie. It stung to see her thriving in a way I never thought possible, especially with Chris by her side. But then I reminded myself of everything they had done, of the chaos they had created. Helen made her choices. She tore our lives apart, and now she was lying in the bed she made, both literally and figuratively. At one point, in a moment of fleeting stupidity, I found myself scrolling through her OnlyFans page. It wasn't just her body she was selling. It was her entire identity, packaged and commodified. Seeing the woman I once loved in that light was difficult, but it was clear she had no shame about it anymore. And there was Chris, right there alongside her, orchestrating the whole thing. It felt like reliving a nightmare all over again. But in the end, I reminded myself of who I'd become, the person I'd had to grow into to survive everything Helen and Chris had put me through. I'd moved on. I had my own life now, and I wasn't about to let their twisted little story drag me back into the past. Helen might be famous now, but it didn't matter. Her choices, her life, her empire, they no longer had any power over me. Still, seeing her flaunt her success with Chris at her side felt like one last slap in the face from a chapter one was working hard to leave behind. But I was stronger now. I knew what I needed to do to keep moving forward. They could have their fame, their money, and their so-called empire. Me? I had my peace of mind, and that was worth more than any fortune or fame they could ever hope to achieve. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel. Bye.